The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Mongoose like a knife through silk. Staff Sergeant Katerina Ghost Voss was 3 sips into her fourth cup of coffee when the transmission that would change everything pierced the darkness of the communications tent. The voice on the other end belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, call sign Triton 6, and his words carried the weight of men about to die. Mongoose Base, this is Triton 6. We are compromised. I repeat, we are compromised. The transmission wavered, punctuated by the distant crack of rifle fire and the low rumble of approaching armor. Enemy tank column moving on our position. Grid reference November 7-4 Alpha. We need immediate support. Heavy support. Ghost set down her mug with deliberate precision, her pale green eyes already calculating distances and approach vectors. Around her, the night shift scrambled into action, but she remained still as stone, listening to something the others couldn't hear. The spaces between Webb's words, the controlled desperation of a SEAL team leader who knew his men were running out of time and options. The situation was impossible by conventional standards. Triton 6 and his 8-man team were pinned down in a valley 12 kilometers northeast of the base, surrounded by what intelligence estimated to be a full mechanized infantry company. The enemy had moved faster than anyone anticipated, cutting off the SEALs' extraction route and trapping them in terrain that offered little cover and no concealment from thermal imaging. Major Harrison's voice boomed across the tent as he coordinated the response. Air support is 20 minutes out minimum. Apache flight is refueling at Camp Liberty. Won't be here for 30. His weathered face was grim in the blue glow of the tactical displays. By the time they arrive, those boys will be body bags. Ghost's fingers drummed once against her thigh, a habit from her days flying Apache before the incident that grounded her and put her behind the controls of something much heavier, much more brutal. The M1A2 Abrams main battle tank designated Revenant sat in the motor pool 200 meters away, 68 tons of depleted uranium and fury that most of her colleagues viewed as an awkward fit for someone who used to dance through the sky. They were wrong about many things when it came to Ghost. They were wrong about her motivations, wrong about her capabilities, and catastrophically wrong about what she would do when American lives hung in the balance. The ridge line between Fob Mongoose and the trapped SEALs was considered impassable for armor, too steep, too unstable, too dangerous for a tank moving at combat speed. But Ghost had spent 3 sleepless nights studying those terrain maps, memorizing every contour line and elevation marker. She knew something that wouldn't appear in any official assessment or tactical manual. Sometimes the most dangerous path was the only path that led home. The morning sun was still an hour away when Ghost made her decision. She grabbed her helmet and walked into the darkness toward Revenant, her boots silent on the packed earth. Behind her, radios chattered with coordinates and contingencies, but she was already gone, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had found clarity in chaos. The SEALs were trapped, conventional rescue was impossible, and time was running out like sand through an hourglass. What happened next would be discussed in briefing rooms and barracks for years to come, but in that moment, Ghost was simply a soldier moving toward her tank, carrying the weight of 8 lives, and the knowledge that sometimes the only way through hell was straight down the middle. The sky above was clear and cold, stars fatting as the eastern horizon began to blush with the promise of dawn. Soon, that same sky would tremble with the thunder of a 68-ton angel of death, rolling over a ridge that shouldn't be possible to cross. The radio in the communications tent continued to crackle with Webb's increasingly desperate situation reports, but Ghost was no longer listening. She was thinking about momentum and physics, about the precise angle needed to keep a tank from tumbling end over end down a 40-degree slope. She was thinking about 8 men who had wives and children and parents who still called them by their first names, not their call signs. Most of all, she was thinking about the last words her Apache gunner had said before the RPG took them out of the sky 18 months ago. Ghost, You've got to find another way to fly. Tommy Castellanos had died believing she would. Tonight, she intended to prove him right, even if it meant teaching a tank to dance on the edge of forever. The mission was simple in concept and impossible in execution, exactly the kind of problem that had always suited Katerina Voss just fine. Lieutenant Commander Webb's voice cut through the static again, strained now with the particular exhaustion that comes from holding a perimeter against overwhelming odds. Mongoose Base, Triton 6. Contact front, contact left. They're massing for a final push. Whatever you've got, we need it now. The transmission ended in a burst of automatic weapons fire that made everyone in the communications tent wince. Ghost reached Revenant as the tank's engine was still ticking cool in the desert air. Her crew chief, Sergeant First Class Ramon Diesel Martinez, was already performing his pre-mission inspection with the methodical precision of a man who understood that overlooked details had a way of killing people. He looked up as Ghost approached, reading something in her expression that made him straighten unconsciously. "Ma'am." Diesel's voice carried the questioning tone of someone who had served with Ghost long enough to recognize when she was operating beyond the boundaries of standard procedure. "Spin her up, Diesel. Full combat load. Sabot rounds priority." Ghost's voice was calm, almost conversational, but Martinez had learned to listen for the steel beneath her words. "Where we headed, Ghost?" This from her gunner, Staff Sergeant Deshaun Prophet Williams, who was emerging from the ammunition bunker with the purposeful stride of someone carrying high-explosive ordnance. Ghost climbed onto Revenant's hull and turned toward the northeast, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to silhouette the ridge line that stood between Fob Mongoose and 8 dying men. The slope looked impossibly steep from this angle, a wall of rock and scree that should have been enough to deter any sane tank commander. But sanity was a luxury that Ghost had abandoned somewhere over the mountains of Afghanistan, along with her aircraft and her gunner and her certainty that the world made sense. "We're going to give the SEALs some close air support," she said, dropping through the commander's hatch. "From the ground." Martinez paused in his preparations, wrench frozen halfway to a track tension point. "Ma'am, that ridge line is impassable for conventional tactics," Ghost finished. "Good thing we're not feeling particularly conventional tonight." She settled into her position and began the startup sequence, her hands moving across controls with the muscle memory of countless hours in the simulator and the grim determination of someone who had already calculated the odds and decided they were irrelevant. The Honeywell AGT-1500 turbine began its familiar whine, building from whisper to roar as Revenant came alive around them. 68 tons of American engineering and fighting spirit responded to Ghost's touch like a faithful animal awakening from sleep. In the commander's position, she could feel every subtle vibration through the steel, every minor adjustment of the suspension system as the tank settled into its combat stance. Prophet's voice came through the intercom as he completed his gunnery checks. "Main gun ready, cokes ready, 50 cal ready. Whatever we're doing, we're ready to do it with authority." Through her periscope, Ghost could see the activity around the motor pool increasing as word of their movement spread through the base. Major Harrison would be furious when he discovered what she intended, but by then it would be too late to stop her. The SEALs had maybe 20 minutes before the enemy armor closed their noose completely, and conventional rescue was still 15 minutes behind that timeline. Ghost keyed her radio to the command frequency. "Mongoose Base, this is Revenant, moving to provide fire support for Triton 6. Estimated time to contact 12 minutes. The pause that followed was heavy with disbelief and dawning understanding. When Major Harrison's voice finally crackled through the headset, it carried the controlled fury of a commanding officer watching his carefully laid plans dissolve into chaos. "Revenant Mongoose Base, you are ordered to hold position until air assets arrive. That ridge line is not passable for armor. Acknowledge." Ghost adjusted her headset and checked her ammunition count one final time. 42 rounds of 120 high explosive and armor-piercing ordnance, enough to level a city block or punch through any defensive position the enemy might have prepared. Behind her, Diesel had completed his checks and was waiting for her command, his usual stream of good-natured complaints replaced by the focused silence of a professional preparing for combat. Mongoose Base, Revenant. I understand your concerns, but sometimes the only way around an obstacle is straight through it. Ghost's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had already committed to a course of action beyond recall. Ghost out. She switched frequencies before Harrison could respond, tuning into the SEAL team's tactical channel just in time to hear Webb coordinating defensive fires. His men were running low on ammunition and lower on hope, but their discipline remained absolute even as the enemy tightened the noose around their position. Ghost pressed the intercom button. All stations, this is Ghost. We're about to attempt something that the tactical manuals would probably classify as either brilliant or suicidal. Diesel, I need every bit of power you can give me. Prophet, when we clear this ridge, I want a firing solution on every piece of armor you can identify. Questions. The silence that followed was not hesitation but professional assessment. These men had served with Ghost long enough to understand that her unconventional approaches often succeeded precisely because they fell outside enemy expectations. Martinez had been with her since her transition from aviation to armor, and Prophet had seen her thread Revenant through defensive positions that should have been impossible to breach. "No questions, ma'am," Diesel finally said. "But for the record, this is either going to be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen or the last thing I ever see." Ghost smiled grimly as Revenant began to move, tracks biting into the packed earth with mechanical determination. "Let's make sure it's both, Sergeant." The tank rolled forward into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying 3 soldiers and 42 rounds toward an appointment with physics, gravity, and the kind of tactical problem that could only be solved by someone crazy enough to believe that tanks could fly. Behind them, Fob Mongoose buzzed with activity as word spread of Ghost's unauthorized mission. Ahead of them, 8 SEALs held their perimeter against impossible odds, unaware that salvation was approaching in the form of a tank crew that had decided to rewrite the rules of armored warfare. The ridge line loomed before them, steep and forbidding in the darkness, but Ghost had spent too many nights studying those contour lines to be intimidated now. Somewhere on the other side, American soldiers were running out of time, ammunition, and options. That was really all she needed to know. Revenant's tracks found purchase on the lower slopes of the ridge, and Ghost began her climb into legend. The ascent began in darkness thick enough to swallow sound itself, broken only by the mechanical symphony of Revenant's tracks grinding against stone and the steady whine of the turbine engine pushed beyond its normal operating parameters. Ghost had never attempted anything like this in an Abrams. Hell, nobody had ever attempted anything like this in an Abrams. But the fundamental principles of physics remained constant whether you were piloting an Apache through mountain passes or threading 68 tons of armor up an impossible slope. The key was momentum and the precise distribution of weight across the tank's track system. Ghost had calculated the approach angle during those sleepless nights studying topographical maps, finding the one narrow path where the slope gradient remained just within the theoretical limits of what the M1A2 could handle. Theoretical being the operative word, since the engineers who designed those specifications had never imagined someone would be insane enough to test them under combat conditions. "Slope angle 28 degrees and climbing," Diesel reported through the intercom, his voice steady despite the fact that they were now committed to a maneuver that could send them tumbling backward in a 68-ton fireball. Engine temperature rising, but still within acceptable parameters. Through her commander's periscope, Ghost could see nothing but darkness and the occasional shower of sparks as their tracks found purchase on bare rock. The tank's sophisticated stabilization system was working overtime to keep them level, hydraulic systems whining as they compensated for terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat. Contact bearing 045 degrees. Prophet's voice cut through the mechanical noise as his thermal imaging system picked up heat signatures on the far side of the ridge. Count 4. Make that 6 enemy vehicles. Looks like T-72s in hull-down positions. Ghost absorbed this information without changing her focus on the climb. The enemy had positioned their armor to cover the approaches to the valley where the SEALs were trapped, creating interlocking fields of fire that would shred any conventional rescue attempt. But they had positioned for conventional approaches, not for the appearance of an American main battle tank materializing on their flank like an avenging spirit. The radio crackled with Webb's increasingly desperate situation reports. Mongoose Base, Triton 6. They're moving up mortars. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they can drop rounds right on top of us. His voice carried the professional calm of a man accepting his likely death while still fighting to save his team. Ghost keyed her microphone. Triton 6 Revenant, hang tight, cavalry's coming. Revenant Triton 6, say again, did someone just claim to be cavalry? The slope was approaching its steepest section now, the point where Ghost's calculations suggested they would either clear the crest or discover that physics had final veto power over courage and determination. Revenant's nose pitched upward at an angle that made her stomach lurch, tracks clawing for purchase on loose shale that shifted ominously beneath their weight. Diesel, I need everything she's got, Ghost commanded, feeling the tank's momentum beginning to falter as gravity asserted its inexorable authority. You've got it, Ghost. She's singing at the red line, but she's still singing. The moment of truth arrived without fanfare or dramatic music, just the sudden sensation of the tank's hull leveling out as they crested the ridge. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, Revenant was perfectly balanced on the knife edge of the slope, 68 tons of armor and determination poised between success and catastrophe. Then they were over, the tank's nose dipping as they began their descent toward the valley floor, where 6 enemy tanks waited in positions that had been carefully prepared to repel attacks from every direction, except the one Ghost had chosen. Prophet, light them up, Ghost ordered as Revenant's main gun swung toward the nearest T-72. Sabot, tank front. The 120mm smoothbore cannon spoke with a voice like controlled thunder, sending a depleted uranium penetrator downrange at nearly a mile per second. The enemy tank simply ceased to exist, its turret blown clear of the hull in a spectacular display of American military engineering applied with surgical precision. Before the enemy could react to this impossible development, Prophet had already acquired his second target. Tank left, Sabot loaded. Fire! The second T-72 joined its companion in oblivion, but now the surviving enemy crews were beginning to respond, turrets swinging toward this unexpected threat that had materialized from an impossible direction. Ghost felt the familiar calm that settled over her in combat, the same focus that had made her one of the most effective Apache pilots in theater before the incident that had grounded her. Movement left, 2 more tanks coming up from defilade, Prophet reported, his voice carrying the professional excitement of a gunner who had found his element. Revenant was moving now at combat speed across the valley floor, tracks throwing up rooster tails of dust as Ghost maneuvered to unmask Prophet's field of fire while denying the enemy clean shots at their flanks. It was a deadly dance performed by partners who had learned to read each other's intentions through months of training and combat operations. The third enemy tank managed to fire before Prophet could engage, its main gun belching flame and smoke as a 125mm round screamed past Revenant's turret with inches to spare. Ghost felt the concussion through the tank's hull but didn't flinch, already adjusting their position for Prophet's return shot. Sabot up, Prophet announced with grim satisfaction. Say goodbye, Ivan. The enemy tank died in fire and twisted metal, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that lit up the valley like a brief sunrise. Ghost could see the SEAL positions now, 8 men in a defensive circle that was being steadily compressed by advancing infantry and the 3 remaining enemy tanks. Triton 6 Revenant, we're coming up on your 6 o'clock. Mark your position with IR strobes. Webb's response carried a note of incredulous relief. Revenant, Triton 6, are you actually a tank? Because I'm looking at a tank, and tanks don't usually appear out of thin air. Long story, Ghost replied as Prophet engaged the 4th enemy tank with methodical precision. Short version is that sometimes the only way to fly is with tracks instead of rotors. The tactical situation was shifting rapidly now, as the enemy formation tried to adjust to a threat they had never anticipated. Their carefully prepared defensive positions became death traps, as Revenant's superior armor and firepower carved through them with devastating efficiency. Ghost had learned in her Apache days that surprise was often more valuable than numerical superiority, and tonight was proving that lesson all over again. Last 2 tanks are pulling back, Prophet reported as his 5th kill added another column of black smoke to the dawn sky. They're trying to get some distance, maybe call for support. Ghost adjusted their heading to pursue the retreating armor. Negative, we don't let them regroup. Diesel, can you give me flank speed? Can do, Ghost. This old girl's got plenty of fight left in her. Revenant surged forward across the valley floor, closing the distance with the fleeing enemy tanks before they could establish new firing positions. It was a calculated risk. Chasing armor across open ground violated several tactical principles. But Ghost had learned that sometimes the most dangerous course of action was also the most effective. The 6th enemy tank turned to make a final stand, its crew demonstrating the kind of desperate courage that Ghost could respect even as she prepared to destroy them. Prophet's shot was perfect, punching through the T-72's frontal armor and detonating its ammunition in a fireball that marked the end of organized enemy resistance in the valley. The 7th and final tank never had a chance to fire. Ghost had maneuvered Revenant into a position where the enemy's retreat path led directly into Prophet's killing ground, and the 120 sabot round found its mark with the inevitability of physics and superior training. Silence settled over the valley like a blanket, broken only by the crackle of burning vehicles and the distant sound of enemy infantry, withdrawing to positions beyond the range of Revenant's coaxial machine gun. Ghost keyed her radio to the SEAL frequency, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a mission accomplished against impossible odds. Triton 6 Revenant, valley is clear. We're coming in to pick up passengers. Webb's response came through clearly now, no longer distorted by the electromagnetic interference of nearby explosions. Revenant, Triton 6, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. How the hell did you get a tank over that ridge? Ghost guided Revenant toward the SEAL positions, where 8 men were emerging from cover with the careful movements of warriors who had just discovered they were going to live through the night. Simple physics, Commander. What goes up doesn't always have to come down the same way it went up. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson that transformed the smoking wreckage into something almost beautiful, Ghost allowed herself a moment to appreciate what they had accomplished. 8 American lives saved, an enemy armor unit destroyed, and a tactical problem solved through the application of unconventional thinking and superior firepower. But more than that, she had found a way to fly again. Not through the sky that had been taken from her when that RPG found its mark 18 months ago, but through the kind of precise, deadly maneuver that turned a 68-ton main battle tank into an instrument of salvation. Tommy Castellanos had been right. She had found another way to fly. It just happened to involve tracks instead of rotors and depleted uranium instead of Hellfire missiles. The SEALs reached Revenant's position just as Major Harrison's voice crackled through the command frequency. carrying the controlled fury of a commanding officer who had watched one of his subordinates ignore direct orders and somehow pull off a miracle in the process. Revenant, Mongoose Base. You are ordered to return to base immediately for debriefing. And Ghost, we're going to have a very long conversation about following orders and risk assessment. Ghost smiled as she watched Webb's team climb aboard Revenant for the ride back to Fob Mongoose. Copy that, Mongoose Base. But for the record, risk assessment is a lot easier when you remember that some things are worth any risk. The ride back to base was a triumphant procession, Revenant carrying her crew and 8 grateful SEALs across terrain that looked completely different in the morning light. The ridge that had seemed so imposing in darkness was revealed as challenging but not impossible, just another obstacle that had been overcome through preparation, skill, and the kind of calculated audacity that separated exceptional soldiers from merely good ones. As they approached Fob Mongoose, Ghost could see the crowd gathering to witness their return. Word of her unauthorized rescue mission had spread through the base like wildfire, carrying with it the kind of legend that would be told and retold in briefing rooms and barracks for years to come. The staff sergeant who had somehow made a main battle tank fly over an impossible ridge to save 8 SEALs trapped behind enemy lines. But Ghost was already thinking beyond the immediate aftermath, beyond the inevitable conversations with Major Harrison and the after-action reports that would try to capture what had happened in clinical military language. She was thinking about the night Tommy Castellanos had died and his final words about finding another way to fly. Tonight, she had proven him right. Revenant had become her new aircraft, the valley floor her new sky, and physics her new co-pilot. The transition from Apache to Abrams was complete, marked not by paperwork or ceremony, but by the kind of combat action that defined what it meant to be a soldier in the truest sense of the word. The SEALs would return to their families, carrying stories of the tank crew that had appeared out of nowhere to snatch them from certain death. The enemy would withdraw to lick their wounds and wonder how American armor had achieved the impossible. And Ghost would continue serving, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the most important victories came from refusing to accept that something couldn't be done. As Revenant rolled through the gates of Fob Mongoose, Ghost caught a glimpse of the morning sky through her periscope. Clear and endless, just like it had been on that last flight 18 months ago. The sky that had taken so much from her, but had also given her the skills and perspective she needed to save 8 lives when it mattered most. Tommy Castellanos had been right about finding another way to fly. He just hadn't mentioned that the best flights sometimes happened with 68 tons of armor beneath you and the certain knowledge that you had done something impossible simply because it needed to be done. Ghost keyed her intercom one final time as they approached the motor pool where this adventure had begun less than 2 hours ago. Outstanding work, gentlemen. Diesel Prophet, that was some of the finest tank work I've ever seen. We just proved that with the right crew and the right motivation, there's no such thing as impossible terrain. The response from her crew was immediate and heartfelt, the kind of professional satisfaction that came from executing a perfect mission under the worst possible conditions. They had rolled over a ridge that shouldn't be passable, engaged and destroyed 7 enemy tanks, and rescued 8 American soldiers without taking a scratch. By any measure, it had been a good night's work. But as Ghost began the process of shutting down Revenant systems, she was already looking ahead to the next mission, the next impossible problem that would require unconventional solutions. Because that was what soldiers did, they found ways to accomplish the mission, regardless of the obstacles in their path. The sky above Fob Mongoose was clear and bright, full of possibilities and promise, and 68 tons of American armor sat quietly in the motor pool, ready to fly again whenever duty called. Lieutenant Commander Webb found Ghost an hour later in the maintenance bay, where she was personally inspecting every system on Revenant, with the methodical attention to detail that had kept her alive through 2 tour and 1 career transition. The SEAL officer still carried the dust and cordite stains of combat, but his eyes held the particular alertness of someone who had just experienced something beyond the normal parameters of military operations. "Staff Sergeant," Webb began, then stopped, apparently searching for words adequate to the situation. "What you did out there, that wasn't just good soldiering. That was something else entirely." Ghost looked up from the track tension she was checking, wrench still in hand. "It was necessary, sir. Your men needed support, and we were in position to provide it." "In position?" Webb's voice carried a note of incredulous respect. "You were 12 kilometers away behind an impassable ridge line. Nobody puts armor in that position because armor can't operate in that terrain." "With respect, sir, impassable is just another way of saying that nobody's been motivated enough to find the right approach." Ghost returned her attention to the maintenance checklist, but Webb could see the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Webb studied the woman who had just redefined what was possible in armored warfare. Ghost was smaller than he had expected, compact and efficient in the way that career military personnel often were, but there was something in her bearing that suggested depths beyond her rank and position. The easy confidence with which she handled technical equipment, the way her crew deferred to her judgment without question, these were markers of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than authority. "Your crew mentioned that you used to fly helicopters," Webb said, settling onto a nearby crate of spare parts. "Apache pilot before you transitioned to armor." Ghost's hands paused for a moment in their work, and Webb saw something flicker across her expression, not pain exactly, but the kind of carefully controlled reaction that spoke of significant personal history. "That's correct, sir. Attack aviation, 3 tour in Afghanistan before I decided to try something with more armor plating." "More armor plating," Webb repeated slowly. "Is that really why you switched to tanks?" The maintenance bay was quiet except for the distant sounds of base operations and the tick of cooling metal as Revenant settled into post-mission rest. Ghost completed her inspection and set down the wrench, finally giving Webb her full attention. "The honest answer, sir. I switched because I needed to prove something to myself. Flying was supposed to be the ultimate expression of military aviation, speed, precision, the ability to engage targets from beyond their engagement envelope. But when my bird got shot down and my gunner didn't make it out, I started wondering if there was something to be said for the more direct approach." Webb nodded slowly. The military was full of personnel who had been shaped by defining moments of loss and discovery, but Ghost's transition from air to ground operations represented something more fundamental than a simple change of specialty. You wanted to see if you could accomplish the same mission with different tools. Something like that. Ghost began collecting her maintenance equipment with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Turns out that the principles are more similar than you might expect. Situational awareness, target identification, coordinated movement. The fundamentals remain constant whether you're doing it from 3,000 feet or ground level. Except that helicopter pilots don't usually drive their aircraft over impossible terrain to conduct direct fire support missions, Webb pointed out. Ghost paused in her equipment gathering and looked directly at the SEAL commander. "No, sir, they don't. But tank commanders don't usually have to worry about RPGs knocking them out of the sky, either. Every platform has its advantages and limitations. The key is understanding which advantages apply to the specific problem you're trying to solve." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Harrison, whose expression suggested that Ghost's explanation of tactical advantages was about to be tested against the realities of military discipline and chain of command. The commanding officer's stride carried the particular energy of someone who had spent the last 2 hours fielding questions from higher headquarters about how one of his tank commanders had managed to violate several laws of physics while conducting an unauthorized rescue mission. "Staff Sergeant Voss," Harrison began, his voice carrying the controlled tone that experienced soldiers recognized as the calm before the storm. "Commander Webb, I need to borrow my tank commander for a comprehensive discussion about operational planning and risk management." Webb stood and offered Ghost a brief nod that somehow conveyed both gratitude and respect. "Staff Sergeant, if you ever decide you want to try your hand at maritime operations, the SEALs could use someone with your particular approach to impossible problems." "Thank you, sir, but I think I've found my calling with armor operations. Turns out there's something very satisfying about solving problems with a 120 main gun." As Webb departed, Harrison settled into the position the SEAL commander had vacated, his weathered features carrying the expression of someone trying to balance appreciation for exceptional performance with the requirements of military discipline. Ghost continued her equipment inventory, waiting for her commanding officer to begin what was clearly going to be a complex conversation. "Ghost," Harrison began, then stopped and shook his head. "Katerina, what you accomplished out there was extraordinary. 8 American lives saved, an enemy armor unit destroyed, 0 friendly casualties. By any tactical measure, it was a perfect operation." "But," Ghost prompted, recognizing the tone that indicated significant reservations despite successful outcomes. "But you ignored direct orders, violated operational safety protocols, and attempted a maneuver that could have resulted in the loss of a $68 million weapons system and 3 highly trained crew members." Harrison's voice carried the weight of someone who understood that military effectiveness required balancing individual initiative with institutional discipline. Ghost completed her inventory and faced her commanding officer directly. "Sir, with respect, sometimes the choice is between following protocols and accomplishing the mission. In this case, the mission was saving 8 American soldiers who were about to die. I chose the mission, even if it meant risking your crew and your equipment. Sir, I calculated the risks and determined that the probability of successful mission completion exceeded the probability of catastrophic failure. My crew was briefed on the nature of the operation and volunteered to proceed. As for the equipment," Ghost gestured toward Revenant, still cooling from their morning's work, "equipment can be replaced. American soldiers cannot." Harrison studied the woman who had just redefined what was possible in armored operations. Ghost's service record was exemplary: top graduate from the Armor Officer Basic Course, distinguished performance in 2 combat deployments, crew evaluations that consistently rated her as exceptional in all categories. But her background in aviation gave her a perspective on tactical problems that conventional armor officers rarely possessed. "Walk me through your decision-making process," Harrison said finally. "From the moment you heard Webb's transmission to the moment you decided to take Revenant over that ridge." Ghost settled onto a maintenance stool, her expression becoming focused in the way that indicated careful consideration of complex factors. The initial assessment was straightforward: 8-man SEAL team trapped in terrain that provided minimal cover, enemy armor moving to close the noose, conventional air support 20 to 30 minutes out. By the time Apache flights arrived, the SEALs would be overrun. "Agreed. That's why I was coordinating with higher headquarters to expedite close air support and exploring options for artillery fire missions." "Which would have been effective if we had 20 minutes to spare," Ghost acknowledged. But Webb's transmissions indicated that they had maybe 5 to 10 minutes before the enemy closed to direct fire range. The tactical problem required an immediate solution with assets currently available. Harrison nodded, following Ghost's logic even as he recognized the audacity of her conclusion. "And you determined that Revenant was an available asset capable of providing immediate support." "I determined that Revenant was the only available asset capable of reaching the SEAL's position in time to affect the tactical situation. The question became whether the ridge line approach was feasible within acceptable risk parameters." Acceptable risk parameters for a maneuver that no tank crew has ever attempted under combat conditions, Harrison pointed out. Ghost's expression didn't change, but Harrison caught a glimpse of the steel that had carried her through 3 combat tours and a career transition that would have broken lesser soldiers. Sir, acceptable risk is a relative concept. The risk of losing Revenant and crew during the ridge approach was significant but manageable. The risk of 8 SEALs dying while we waited for conventional support was 100% certain. The mathematics of her argument were undeniable, even if the execution had violated every conventional principle of armored warfare. Harrison found himself in the unusual position of needing to discipline a subordinate for achieving perfect mission success through methods that should have been impossible. The ridge approach itself, Harrison continued, walk me through that decision. Topographical analysis indicated a narrow window where slope gradient remained within theoretical limits for M1A2 operations. The key variables were approach angle, momentum maintenance, and weight distribution across the track system. Ghost's voice took on the technical precision of someone who had spent considerable time studying the physics involved. I calculated that with proper technique and optimal engine performance, the maneuver was feasible. Feasible in theory. You had no practical experience with that type of terrain at those angles. Correct, sir, but I did have experience with similar principles from my aviation background. Managing angle of attack, maintaining power settings under extreme conditions, coordinating complex maneuvers while engaging targets. The fundamental skills translate across platforms. Harrison was beginning to understand how Ghost had approached what appeared to be an impossible tactical problem. Her aviation experience had given her a 3-dimensional perspective on terrain and movement that conventional armor officers rarely developed. Combined with her technical expertise and willingness to accept calculated risks, it had enabled her to identify and execute a solution that existed outside normal operational parameters. Your crew went along with this without question. My crew trusted my judgment based on our previous operations together. Diesel and Prophet have seen me thread Revenant through defensive positions that other tank commanders considered impossible. Tonight was an extension of tactics we've developed over multiple combat engagements. The admission revealed another layer of Ghost's operational methodology. She hadn't simply attempted an isolated act of tactical innovation. Tonight's mission had been the culmination of months of unconventional operations that had gradually pushed the boundaries of what her crew believed possible with their equipment. Harrison leaned forward, his expression shifting from disciplinary to genuinely curious. Ghost, what you accomplished out there goes beyond exceptional soldiering. You've essentially created a new tactical doctrine for armored operations in restricted terrain. The question is whether this represents breakthrough thinking or dangerous precedent. Ghost considered the question with the same